Just before dawn, on the 10th of May 1940, the largest concentration of motorised vehicles in history roared into action. After months of quiet, it was the start of Hitler's invasion of the West. What followed next was devastating, a stunning combination of new tactics and new technologies. Hitler's generals didn't just launch a massive attack into Western Europe, they launched a new era in the history of warfare. Britain and France were left reeling. Rarely have two mighty imperial powers been so completely defeated in such a short amount of time. Within 6 weeks, France signed a humiliating armistice. The continent of Europe was effectively in the hands of the Nazis, and Britain and her empire stood alone. It was 6 weeks that led to the conquest of Western Europe, 6 weeks that shaped the course of the 20th century.
I tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In September 1939, Britain, France and their possessions across the oceans declared war on Germany in response to Hitler's invasion of Poland. By the end of the month, almost 150,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had landed in France to bolster the massive French army. These French forces began to probe into Germany's lightly defended western frontier. Hitler was deeply concerned that he would face all-out war on two fronts. But outmoded French tactics, which relied cautiously on heavy artillery cover, slowed any invasion of Germany to a snail's pace. The French attack paused, and with the rapid collapse of Poland, French troops were withdrawn as German reinforcements from the east flooded back west. With the conquest of Poland now complete, and with his agreement with Stalin in place, meaning there was no threat from the east, he could turn his attention to the west. But that would be a very different proposition. Hitler was desperate to avoid the fate that had met Germany in the First World War, getting bogged down in a war of attrition, stalemate, trenches that stretched from the Channel coast to the Swiss Alps. So he wanted a quick, decisive victory. But how could he do this? Because he had less tanks, guns and men than the Western Allies. Hitler and his generals spent the winter months in a feverish back and forth about the best way to mount their offensive. The success of the German campaign against Poland the previous year persuaded Hitler to listen to the urgings of his more aggressive generals, most proponents of the new blitzkrieg. What he agreed to was one of the most daring and unorthodox operational plans in military history. Deployment Directive Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. The plan would see the Germans start their attack along the same route that their fathers had taken in 1914. A big sweep down through Belgium, looking to drive into France through the Pas-de-Calais. Just like 1914, the Germans expected the Allies to march forward to meet them on the fields of Flanders. Except, this time, once the Allies had committed their best troops in the north, the Germans would launch a massive surprise attack through an area known as the Ardennes. The Germans knew the French believed this area was impenetrable to large-scale military operations, and so it was only lightly defended. The powerful Maginot Line ended some 20 kilometres to the east of the sector, and the men on the line were older, B-class divisions, underarmed and underprepared. The German commanders wanted their armoured spearhead to crash into France through this flimsy border, cross the Meuse River and drive hard all the way to the Channel, roughly following the Somme River. The speed of the action would trap the Allied forces in a pocket that could then be crushed by the advancing German forces. It was an audacious plan. It was a risky plan. The Ardennes is a steep, hilly piece of countryside, heavily forested with narrow roads winding through it and deep ravines with fast-flowing rivers at the bottom. It's not good territory for blitzkrieg, which involves spreading out, bypassing strongpoints, surrounding and destroying them. If the Allies found out the Germans were moving through there, they could turn these narrow avenues of advance into killing zones with aerial bombardment and artillery. But it could also be the quiet back door into France. It was risky. Hitler decided to go for it. As winter turned to spring in 1940, the German army began assembling a vast strike force. Right along the German border, facing the Low Countries and France. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the history of warfare. The German armies bristled with modern tanks like the Panzer Mark III and IV. They were outnumbered and outgunned by French tanks like the monster B-1. But what they lacked in firepower they more than made up for, with better speed, optics and communications. These would be decisive if Val Gelb was to succeed. The Allies now knew that an invasion of the West was a question of when rather than if. French planners had long discussed the best way to defend against a future German attack. By 1939, those discussions had evolved into the Dial Plan. Allied forces would dig themselves in along the Dial River in Belgium. This plan allowed for British, French and Belgian troops to link up with the friendly Dutch forces and defend together against the most likely route of German invasion. The biggest issue that France and Britain faced, however, was the staunch neutrality of Belgium and the Netherlands. This plan relied on total cooperation, but until Nazi Germany invaded and the Belgians and Dutch asked for support, the masses of British and French troops could do nothing but wait on the French border. It meant that the solid defensive line on the Dial could not be prepared in advance of an invasion, and the French and British troops would have to race to dig in.
Fall gelb. 5:35 Uhr. Fall gelb, 5:35 Uhr.
Just before dawn on the 10th of May 1940, hundreds of German bombers took off from airstrips across Western Germany. Their target were vital strongpoints, railheads, fortresses in Holland, France and Belgium. Paratroopers were dropped to secure important points, and a swarm of fighters went aloft to stop Allied spotters from looking down on a vast column of armour that was heading through Luxembourg into the Ardennes.
1940 standen wir vor der Aufgabe, den Durchbruch durch die verlängerte Maginot-Linie bei Sedan zu vollziehen.
At the tip of that particular spear was General Heinz Guderian's 19th Armoured Corps, with 745 armoured fighting vehicles, supported by Stuka dive bombs that would act as airborne artillery, sticking close to the lead tanks and delivering 250 kilos of high explosive bombs onto any enemy strongpoints. Behind them were over 41,000 other vehicles, bringing up men and supplies for the advancing army. Facing this formidable opponent, there were two French armies of infantry on this front. For the most part, they were underprepared and under-equipped. Remember, this was supposed to be a quiet sector. They had about 250 tanks, but they were parcelled out in small groups along a 60-mile front to support the infantry, making them, frankly, useless. Within 4 hours of the invasion starting, Luxembourg had been swamped and Guderian's fast armoured cars were already entering Belgium. The main break on the tempo of the advance was just the narrow roads and the sheer volume of traffic. After 24 hours, there was a queue of vehicles stretching 120 miles, and some units were yet to even leave Germany. The Luftwaffe was maintaining careful watch on the skies above, but some Allied spotter planes did get through and reported activity in the Ardennes, which Allied High Command dismissed as a feint. So far, Fall Gelb was working. On the morning of the 12th of May, 48 hours since the start of the attack, Allied resistance in the village of Bouillon on the French-Belgian border collapsed. The report says the infantry were fat and flabby 30-somethings with slack discipline. They collapsed and fled when German armoured vehicles approached from the rear. In the north, the Dutch army was fighting a desperate rearguard action as the Germans swept across the country. And in Belgium, Fort Ebenemer was one of the most modern fortresses in Europe, and yet it fell to the Nazis. The British and French needed the Belgians to hold off the Germans for several weeks to allow the Dial plan to get into action. 2 days into the attack, the Allied plan for defence was already in tatters. By nightfall, lead German elements were taking up position on the River Meuse. General Rommel was at Dinant and some of his men crept across a weir to gain a foothold on the far side. To the south, General Guderian was at Sedan. Opposite him, the French desperately brought up troops to reinforce the B-class division that was in place. They hoped the Germans would not be ready for several days to attack across the river, while they waited for their heavy guns to be dragged into place. That was wishful thinking. At 10 o'clock, the full might of the German blitzkrieg was unleashed against the French defenders at Sedan. First came 90 Stuka bombers. They attacked artillery positions. Then Dornier horizontal bombers came to pound any French defences they could find. They were joined by more Stukas who came screaming out of the sky, their sirens terrifying defenders below, raining down bombs and bullets on individual positions. It was the biggest concentration of German air power in the invasion of the West so far. At 4 in the afternoon, German combat engineers dragged their heavy rafts down to the bank and began paddling across the river. Amazingly, only 56 French casualties were reported as a result of the bombardment, and most of the bunkers were still functional. But communications were shattered, as well as the nerve of the defenders, and many fled before the German ground assault reached them. There were some pockets of resistance, but that was quickly mopped up. The defensive line on the Meuse was broken. Pontoon bridges were placed across the river and German troops swarmed across, ready to break up any French counterattacks. Despite some pockets of resistance, the French were overwhelmed. Defeat turned into rout as many of their troops threw away their weapons and fled. The 14th of May would prove to be a particularly dark day for the Allies. The Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing raid on the Dutch city of Rotterdam and effectively razed it to the ground. Fearing further appalling loss of life to the civilian population should the war continue, the Dutch government capitulated. The north flank of the Allied defences had collapsed. By now, the Allies were retreating right along the line, and Hitler at this stage became worried that the German troops were advancing too fast. They might become overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. He ordered them to slow down. But Guderian was sure that he could sniff the total collapse of the Western Allies. So through some deception and sort of artistic interpretation of Hitler's orders, he kept pushing his men as hard as they could towards the Channel coast. It was the start of the breakout. On the 15th of May 1940, the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received a call from the French Premier, Paul Reynaud. He said, "We are defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill desperately tried to rally his opposite number, reminding him of the defence of Paris in 1914 when all seemed lost. Nevertheless, Churchill, who'd been Prime Minister for just 5 days, took the decision to get to France as soon as possible. On the 16th of May, Churchill flew to Paris to meet Reynaud and senior French commanders like General Maurice Gamelin. Churchill realised immediately something was not right. The French were burning their papers and getting ready to flee from Paris. Churchill said to Gamelin, "Where is your strategic reserve?" And Gamelin replied, "Aucune." There is none. Churchill later described it as one of the most shocking moments of his life. Churchill asked where the Allies would launch a counterattack. He got the reply, inferiority of numbers, inferiority of equipment, inferiority of methods. The French deployed their best units in the north against the German advance into Belgium. They were now hundreds of miles away from Guderian's hammer blow through the Ardennes and unable to do anything about the German breakout. Charles de Gaulle, leading the French 4th Armoured Division, did have some success while using his tanks as a concentrated unit, causing the German advance to slow, but ultimately he too would be overwhelmed. By the 19th of May, the Germans were on the move again. They smashed through 2 fairly weak British Territorial Army divisions on the Somme, and the following day, the reconnaissance unit of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Noyelles-sur-Mer. The German army was on the Channel coast. The noose was tightening round the neck of the British and French. The Allies were now in disarray. They were desperate to break out of the pocket the Germans had created, but communications between the nations was breaking down. The French launched an attack at Cambrai. Unbeknown to them, the British launched one at Arras. Despite some initial successes, they too were unable to break through German lines. On the 23rd of May, Lord Gort, head of the British Expeditionary Force in France, ordered a retreat from Arras and made the decision to head to the Channel ports. They needed to escape. For the British troops trapped in this enclave, it was now a matter of survival. Guderian was still acting against the spirit of command he was receiving from higher up. They were telling him to slow down, but he could sense that British defeat was imminent. He wanted to try and encircle, perhaps capture intact the entire BEF. On the 25th of May, Boulogne fell. The following day, the 26th, it was Calais' turn. All British efforts were now directed at protecting the last of the Channel ports. On the evening of the 26th of May, Winston Churchill ordered the evacuation of the BEF from Europe, using the port of Dunkirk. It was the start of Operation Dynamo. For a week, the Allies poured into the area around Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of men of the BEF and the French army went down onto the beaches and were picked up by vessels of all kinds. Thames steamers, pleasure boats and ferries that had heeded the call of the Royal Navy to get the men back to the safety of England. Churchill and the British High Command had expected they might be able to evacuate around 45,000 men from the port. But the sacrificial efforts of the French, British and Belgian troops to slow the German advance and the heroic efforts of the Royal Navy meant that almost 350,000 men were saved. It was a humiliating retreat for the Allies. Belgium was forced to surrender. The British and French, who had managed to escape, had to leave behind most of their equipment: guns, ammunition, supplies and vehicles. and hundreds of thousands of men, including the best French units, had been killed or were captured by the Germans. Once the pocket on the Channel coast had been stamped out, the Germans could turn their attention to the rest of the French army. This next phase they called Fall Rot, Case Red. General Weygand didn't think that he could match the German army right across the line, so instead he decided to turn towns and villages into individual strongpoints, like breakwaters, hoping to slow the spread of the German advance. The French use of their armour slowly improved. They were able to slow the Germans down this time, but it was the Germans' all-arms attack, including their Luftwaffe, which simply overwhelmed the French ability to withstand them. On the 10th of June, Paris was declared an open city, and on the 14th, the German army marched into the French capital. The German army marched on, surrounding the fortresses of the Maginot Line, causing them to surrender and pushing further and further south into France. On the 16th of June, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned his position. He was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain. He immediately announced his intention to sign an armistice with the Germans. As soon as he heard that the French government wanted an armistice, Hitler knew that he would drag them to the forest of Compiègne, where, in November 1918, the exhausted German army had agreed to the armistice that had ended fighting in the First World War. In fact, he went one step further. He forced the French delegation into the same railway carriage that the Germans had signed that fateful document in. The French agreed and signed. Fighting finished on the morning of the 25th of June 1940. The fall of France was complete. France was carved in two, with the occupied north and the so-called free zone of Vichy France in the south. And what now began was 4 terrifying years as the French people had to survive beneath the yoke of Nazism. By the end of June, Britain and its empire were standing alone against Nazi Germany. It would only be a matter of time before British people in communities right across the country would feel the might of German assault. As Winston Churchill famously said in his finest hour speech,
"What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin."
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.